Hello, this is Mark Langgin with New Frontier Action. Thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon, this Wednesday noon hour. For those that are just joining us for the first time, we go live here regularly at newfrontieraction.com/live. You can also catch us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch, along with our partners at No Justice, No Peace. And so this month for Black History Month, we made the decision that we wanted to talk about a lot of topics related to social and economic justice, racial justice, and kind of ways that it intersects with other parts of our economy and progressive politics generally. And so we wanted to have a conversation about climate. And I was reading a piece in the New York Times talking about pipeline politics and particularly highlighting the story of the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, and referenced a professor up at Macalester College named James Doyle. Oh, and there's my assistant Maisie there in the background that's joining us. She's staying home with me today. But Professor Doyle works in areas related to materials science in energy production and storage, works on issues related to the grid, and has been involved in talking and learning about what's going on with Line 3 up in Minnesota. And so we thought it'd be good to bring Professor Doyle on to join us today. And Professor Doyle, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me.
No, thank you. I'm glad you're able to join us. So for the folks that are watching at home on our various platforms, I gave a little bit of a brief intro as far as who you are and that you teach and work at Macalester, but your background is in, you work on energy storage and grid work related to climate, but tell us a little bit more about your background in the climate discussion.
Sure. So, so I'm a professor of physics at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I specialize in both in teaching and in research and energy related topics. So I teach courses on energy, mostly focusing on renewable energy. And I do research in materials for energy, mainly solar cell materials, although I've branched out a little bit into storage materials. And then recently I've also started working in grid modeling. So how do you incorporate large amounts of solar and wind and storage, and how do you optimize that sort of thing? So that's my academic life is kind of centered around those topics. I also do some volunteer work with community-based environmental organizations, MN 350, working on their pipeline resistance team, and also with St. Paul 350, where our focus is on energy issues in St. Paul. But I should say that I am not representing either Macalester College, MN 350, or St. Paul 350 here, just representing myself.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And the topic that kind of led me to reach out to you is dealing with pipelines. In Iowa, we've, had our own debates over pipelines coming across the state and bringing Bakken shale gas and oil across Iowa and some of the local control issues. But specifically, we wanted to talk about Line 3. And for folks that are just kind of getting an understanding of this issue, this has been a topic of discussion in Minnesota for a long time. It's an extension of existing pipeline infrastructure that's been there, is my understanding, but has taken on more of more volume in the discussion as a result of its connection to the tar sands issues and how it gets tied into talking with Keystone and the Dakota Access Pipeline across Iowa. So for our viewers, give a little bit of a background on Line 3 and what Enbridge Energy is wanting to accomplish and what's the status of things in Minnesota at the moment.
Sure. So Line 3 is a proposal, a project. Well, I should say it's actually underway now. Construction started in December by a company, Enbridge, who is a Canadian multinational pipeline company. So the purpose of the pipeline then is to transport tar sands oil from Alberta, the Athabasca tar sands fields, to a refinery in Superior, Wisconsin. That's just across the border from Minnesota. So the pipeline then goes across the northern, basically the northern third of Minnesota. And there is an existing pipeline, Line 3, and the project has been described by Enbridge as a replacement project for the existing Line 3. The existing Line 3 is quite old. It was built in the 60s and starting to have integrity problems. So the idea is to replace that pipeline with something using modern materials and techniques. The problem is that's not really a replacement pipeline at all. It's really a brand new pipeline for a couple of reasons. First of all, it doubles the capacity of the existing pipeline. The existing pipeline is 390,000 barrels per day. This one will be 760,000 barrels per day on average, capable of going up all the way up to 915,000 barrels per day. But the other problem is that in the regulatory hearings that it was determined by the administrative law judge that oversaw the contested case that the oil flowing in the so-called replacement will actually be almost all new oil, and that the current oil that's flowing in the current Line 3, which is mostly light crude, will be rerouted to other pipelines. So we really need to think of this pipeline not as simply a replacement, but rather as a brand new pipeline infrastructure with an enormous impact on climate, the oil, the carbon emissions associated with the pipeline, including burning the downstream burning of the oil, the refined oil, is enormous. It's more than the total emissions of the state of Minnesota. It's 5 times the state emissions of electricity. It's 5 times the state emissions of transportation. And a very often cited analog is it's equivalent to building 50 average-sized coal-fired power plants. So this is a huge, for climate, a huge impact on climate. And then the real kicker is that our own Department of Commerce here in Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Commerce, has said that there's never been a real justification for this pipeline, that the company in the regulatory process never provided a demand forecast, what they call demand forecast for the oil. They have not shown that this oil is really needed anywhere. They're just assuming if they can get the oil through that they will be able to sell it, and it's going to be primarily, perhaps exclusively, overseas markets. They're just seeking to expand fossil fuel use in the world, and so that's a big problem from the point of view of climate. The other thing, of course, I think a lot of people are aware of now is that this has a big impact on native populations in northern Minnesota. We have a very high population of native folks up there, and this pipeline runs through lands that were ceded back treaties in the 1800s that gave these the tribes rights to fish and hunt, and especially gather wild rice, which is very important both for their economy but as well as culturally. This pipeline, a major spill from this pipeline, would just be devastating for those very fragile ecosystems. So there's a lot of resistance up north by the Anishinaabe people up there on this. Several of the tribes have mounted lawsuits, both at the state level as well as at the federal level on the permit. So this is in addition to being a climate disaster, it really is a very much a social justice disaster, and it's just, in my view, it's just another example of where a corporation is putting profits before people. They're not listening to the people that live in these areas that depend on having a sound ecology up there for their way of life. And it's not, and these pipelines do spill. It's almost inevitable. There will be a spill of some magnitude sometime in the not too distant future. And this has been well documented. There's lots of statistics on pipeline spills, and it's just something inevitable. So, one might argue that, well, that's a risk of doing business. But again, I come back to the fact that they've never really demonstrated that there's a need for this pipeline in terms of the energy that it provides.
And this is, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's sort of an overview, and I can tell you where things stand right now. But go ahead.
Well, and I think it's important for folks to understand too that this is oil that's being produced in Canada, that's being transported across the United States, portions, to be refined and then shipped out of the country after crossing. Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. I mean, I'm a sportsman and like to fish and camp and those sorts of things. And the pipelines, my understanding, is going to cross over 200 bodies of water, the Mississippi River a couple of times, and those are resources that, if there's spills or accidents, there's really very little recovering from that. And I think the environmental justice story related to that is something that we've been seeing in the climate conversation and in the energy conversation across the country for a long time. I mean, the siting of coal-fired power plants disproportionately impacts communities of color. As far as the siting of those, the siting of our interstate system and roads and bridges has a tendency to move through lower income and communities of color disproportionately in comparison to white communities. And the impacts of climate change on our natural resources and on border communities and in coastal communities is huge. So in terms of where's the legal fight right now in Minnesota? Like, where's that stand? I mean, you mentioned a few lawsuits from some of the tribes in the northern part of the state, but where are things currently at?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the regulatory phase is over. They now have all of the permits that they need. So construction started in December. There are a number of lawsuits that are challenging various types of permits. There's permits that are granted by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the MPCA, as well as permits by the Public Utilities Commission. So various aspects of those permits are being challenged at the state level, the State Court of Appeals, as well as at the federal level. The federal lawsuit is with regard to the water crossing permits. So right now, those are filed. They're under process. Probably will not be ruled on until the summer. That's the prediction. This is a long process, like 6-8 months. So that's where things pretty much stand now. I think there's maybe altogether about half a dozen of these legal challenges, maybe one or two more. The big news that happened just yesterday, in fact, we found out, unfortunately, there's been a push to have the courts grant a stay on construction. So stop construction until these legal challenges play out. And we just heard yesterday from the Minnesota Court of Appeals that they are not granting a stay for the Minnesota lawsuits. So we're waiting now to hear about whether or not there'll be a stay at the granted by the federal courts.
Okay.
So that's kind of where things are at in terms of, we're really down to, well, two things. One is these court challenges. The other thing is that there is a strong movement to put some pressure on President Biden to stop construction, to order a federal environmental impact statement on this, and to suspend all the permits until this can be looked at, and in general, just to kind of review all of the Trump administration policies on permitting. So that's also going forward. We don't have any idea yet. We haven't heard anything from the Biden administration that I know of. I haven't heard anything anyway from them on that. But the hope there is that Biden President Biden will apply the same reasoning for canceling, Keystone XL, which he did recently. I'm sure you heard, was basically on climate impacts of it. The climate impacts of Line 3 are just as bad. So we're hoping that there'll be some movement there. So those are sort of right now, I think, in terms of, officials, the two avenues. One is to see if we can get Biden to stop it, and the other is to wait and see how the court cases play out.
And so in terms of the impact on the debate over climate change and how if we were to stop a pipeline like this, to stop a pipeline project like Keystone XL, or to stop this particular pipeline project, so that deals with supply of crude that ends up refined and then shipped overseas, mostly out of country, in terms of its usages. So what sort of impact would stopping this particular pipeline have on, the delivery, how much oil is being shipped through that pipeline, and what would happen to it if they don't have a way to move it through the pipeline? Does that change the economics for Enbridge, I assume?
I would assume so. Yeah, I would assume that, this would be a big financial hit. Again, I think the results of the regulatory proceedings show that the impact to Minnesota itself will be very minimal. And it's not even clear that there is a need for this pipeline even overseas, where Enbridge thinks that they're going to be shipping it, because, there's even in countries where, maybe they're thinking like China or somewhere like that, which has, very, very much growing in their energy needs. But all countries now are getting very aggressive about climate action, and looking to switch to, for example, electrified transportation and so on. And many of these countries where, such as China, where energy use is growing, I mean, they're very much aware of the problems. I mean, they're having all kinds of difficulties with pollution in the cities and things like that. So, they're making very aggressive climate action policies, and so it's and then the whole oil industry itself has of course, it suffered a big hit with the pandemic, but there's a lot of, and I'm not an expert in this area, I'm not an economist, but I have seen a lot of speculation, at least, that the oil it won't come back. The demand for the oil will not come back to pre-pandemic levels, or at least at that level, and may even be considerably lower than that. So there's a real question about where this oil is going to go and be used. I assume that Enbridge has some ideas about that, and they think they can move it, but I think that's very, very debatable. So and I would say too that I'm not one to say that all oil and all pipelines should be stopped tomorrow. I understand that there needs to be a transition. We need to go about a transition. We need to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, both in terms of oil, but as well as in electricity production as well. So we can't shut down all natural gas plants right now. We can't shut down all oil. But we certainly shouldn't be building brand new infrastructure that's going to be with us for decades, 30, 40, 50 years. That just seems crazy. So, we need to go the other way. We got to stop building new stuff and start decreasing the existing and wean ourselves off that. We only have, on the order of a decade to make real progress on this, according to climate scientists, to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So to build a pipeline that's equivalent to 50 coal-fired power plants in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions, it borders on, in my humble opinion, on lunacy if you're at all concerned about climate change.
Well, we wouldn't go out and build a new dirt road for a Model T or for a horse and buggy. That's not the way that we would create infrastructure jobs. That doesn't make sense. And with the kind of the coming debate on infrastructure and climate at the federal level, I think that we're really looking at how do we move forward. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, as an organization, New Frontier Action, why we work on the climate and energy discussion, because we think that the next wave of infrastructure and jobs is going to be in clean energy and energy storage and revitalization and improvement of the grid, broadband infrastructure, using our expertise and our engineering skills here in this country to really build a new economy that works for all kinds of jobs and not just jobs for moving dirty forms of storing energy, which ultimately that's what oil is a form of energy storage and moving it from Canada outside the United States while risking water quality and the climate impacts. So as we're getting close here to the end of our time, we've had some big news in the last couple of weeks. I mean, everything from the inauguration of our new administration, GM announcing that they were going to be going 100% electric. I think it was by 2035, which is to align with kind of some of the more aggressive climate goals that organizations like MN350 and others have talked about as far as targets for emissions. If there's one thing that you're most excited about that might be part of this conversation around, both infrastructure and a climate bill, what would be if there's one thing that you think would be the most impactful out of those projects on the energy side, what do you think that would be?
Wow, that's a tough question, but I'll give my best answer for it. Because I think there's so many aspects of this. It's hard to pick one thing. It definitely has to be a concerted effort on many fronts, many different types of energy, and then also, of course, we have to bring social justice into it as well. We got to make the transition a fair and equitable transition. I guess for me, my perspective, I'm kind of hoping to see deep electrification of our economy in terms of electric vehicles, and then also eventually in terms of heating and things like that, and then just a carbon-free grid, which I think is something that even 15 years ago just didn't seem to be within the realm of possibility, and now not only is it a possibility, but it really is happening. There's still some issues there. The biggest one probably that I've seen is on storage, and especially long duration storage of energy. So that's the one part of the clean energy agenda that still needs some work, but we're making progress on that. And I always point out to people as they look, if we commit to doing that, if utilities would commit to say we want to have so much short term, so much long duration storage by this time, that's going to incentivize entrepreneurs to make these things affordable. I mean, it's already happening. I think one of the really interesting things that's happened just literally in the last couple of months, been just seeing so much on hydrogen. Whereas, a year ago, again, people were saying hydrogen, that's going to take a while because of the costs associated with, doing that in green hydrogen electrolysis and things like that. We're just not there yet. But just in the last couple of months, I've just been seeing more and more reports of companies and even countries adopting very aggressive policies to increasing and hydrogen. Hydrogen would be a great way to store energy for long-term energy, long duration storage. As long as it's created, in a green way, but you can create hydrogen by using solar and wind and splitting water, a process called electrolysis. So that to me, the next 10 years, I think, and that'll take away, with the electrification of transportation and as much as we can do with industry, and that'll take away the need for things like pipelines and oil and stuff. We can transition to an oil-free, a gas, a coal-free economy. I think we can do it. Maybe 10 years is pretty optimistic, but certainly 20 years. And Biden, also wants, as you mentioned, by 2035 to have our electricity grid carbon-free. That's a very ambitious goal, but I think it also speaks to how much momentum this has now. It's just especially since the election, there's a lot of optimism, and I'm very optimistic about things now.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's, I know that in the last couple months here is post-November that my level of hope as far as some bold action on these topics has really changed. And I'll be paying close attention to what the Biden administration does. I'll be paying close attention to what state legislatures do. around the country to kind of build a new baseline for that. So I just want to say thanks for joining us. I know I reached out to you just pretty much out of the blue, but I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective on what's going on up in Minnesota. If folks are wanting to engage with any organizations in Minnesota that are doing some of this work related to Line 3 and some of this advocacy work, who would the organizations be that you would point people towards? Is there a website, Twitter account? What should they check out?
Yeah. So, well, unfortunately, I'm in terms of things like Twitter, I'm very I'm not a very social media savvy person. I'm not even on Facebook yet. But I would say, well, I can just speak for the groups that I've worked with, and they're all really good. I would say that the two that I'm the most familiar with is MN350 and Sierra Club. And Sierra Club, especially on Line 3, it's just they're doing outstanding work. But and MN350 as well. MN350 has a lot of different kinds of buckets for work. You know, there's the pipeline, but there's also stuff on climate and legislative stuff and things like that. And the same with the Sierra Club. So those are probably the two of the most prominent areas where they have a lot of volunteers, people coming in and volunteering. And then there's others that I would point to. For example, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light also does some great work. The Land Stewardship Project does some work, great work. There's a lot, I think, but I certainly, in terms of numbers, maybe MN350 and Sierra Club. But that's just sort of my impression. And there's a lot of smaller groups too that are working on very specific things, like Line 3, Northfield Against Line 3, for example. And then there's groups up north like Honor the Earth and Friends of the Headwaters. Frontline, a lot of frontline work up there, protests and things of that sort. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think if you just sort of Google whatever topic you're interested in, Minnesota, Google Minnesota Line 3, you'll see
right.
dozens of sites. Minnesota Clean Energy, you'll see lots of stuff there as well.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate it. We're going to be posting links to a number of those organizations on Twitter and on our Facebook accounts. Thank you again for joining us. Be sure to stay warm up north, and don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that we can do to be helpful.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and thank you for all that you're doing.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
So that was Professor Jim Doyle of Macalester College talking with us about Line 3 and Enbridge and climate and energy politics up in Minnesota. Really great to have him on. Make sure that if you get a chance to watch this, to share it with friends. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at New Frontier Fund. And we'll be back tonight at 7:00 p.m. live. Mr. Al Womble, our state director here in Iowa, is going to be having a town hall conversation with Congressman Ro Khanna of California. Congressman Khanna has been spending a lot of time in Iowa talking about entrepreneurship and insourcing and bringing high-tech jobs into rural Iowa and rural areas in general. So join us at 7:00 tonight at newfrontieraction.com/live, and we hope to see you there. Again, this is Mark Langgin. You can find me on Twitter at Mark Langgin, MarkLanggin.